I have mended balances for 41 years. Beam scales, pan scales, spring scales, the big pit weighers that take a whole hauler at once. I know what a true scale sounds like when it settles. There is a small sound in it, a click and a sigh, and if you have listened to enough of them, you can hear a bad bearing the way a doctor hears a bad heart. So I want it understood before I tell any of the rest that I am not a man who believes easily in things. I believe in bearings. I believe in a clean knife edge and a level floor. When the Kelvani speak of the reckoning stone as a god that fell asleep, I have always thought, no, it is a scale. A very large scale built by people who are gone, and it is broken, and nobody has ever had the courage to say so out loud. I was wrong about the broken part. I want that understood too. Heshvara sits in a bowl of gray hills on the seaward side of Alan, and the whole city is arranged around the fact that things come off ships and must be counted. The port is the low ground. Above it, on the terraces, are the counting houses and the bond sheds and the long stone barracks where the salvage crews sleep. And above all of it, on the flat-cut top of the hill, in the open air under the sky, stands the assay court. There is no roof on the assay court. There never was. The Ishan who built it did not put a roof on anything they meant to last. There are only the columns, 60 of them, each one thicker through than a hauler is long, standing in 2 rows and going up out of the dust until you have to lean your head back to find where they stop. Between the rows, the floor is one single sheet of pale stone with no seam in it that any instrument has ever found. And in the middle of that floor stands the stone. It is a balance. That is all it is, and that is the whole difficulty of it. A beam of gray-green stone, 12 strides from end to end, resting on a fulcrum that no one has ever seen properly because the housing that holds it is sealed and has no door. From each end of the beam hang 4 chains, and from the chains hang 2 pans, each one broad enough to park a lifter on. The pans are the height of a man's chest off the floor. You can stand beside one and put your hand flat on its rim and feel how cold the metal stays even at noon. The left-hand pan is closed, not covered, closed the way a fist is closed. It is a shell of the same gray-green stone sealed all around, and whatever is inside it nobody living knows. The Kelvani call it the standard. 900 years ago a survey company from somewhere else in the arm put a bore head to it and the bore head came apart. They tried a cutting beam. The beam went in and did not come out. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was even marked. The company left. The right-hand pan is open. That is where you put your offering. And in 1100 years of records, and in whatever untold thousands of years came before the records, the beam of the reckoning stone has never moved. Not tilted, not trembled, not shifted a hair's breadth in the chains. It hangs there dead level, both pans at the same height, and it has hung that way through 9 dynasties, 2 occupations, 1 long siege, and the whole slow arrival of the human labor contracts, and it has never once said anything to anyone. That is the part that made the Kelvani mad over the centuries. Not the silence, the level, because a scale that hangs level is not a scale that is refusing to answer. It is a scale that is telling you the 2 sides are equal, and yet you can see, with your own eyes, that one pan is empty of everything but the sealed standard, and the other pan is heaped up with the greatest things a civilization ever made. I have stood at the rail and looked into that open pan. Everybody who works the port has, at least once. What is in it is this: a crown, iron, ugly, older than the court, from the first dynasty that came down out of the hills and took the coast. There is a legend that the king who set it there said the words "weigh us now" and then went home and hanged himself, and I do not know if that is true, but the crown is certainly there, and it is certainly rusted through. A ship's keel boss, a slab of dark alloy taller than I am, from the fleet that broke the 2nd occupation. They cut it out of the flagship after the war and carried it up the hill on 140 shoulders. A cabinet of jade, and inside the cabinet, carved into 11 leaves of jade so thin the light comes through them, the entire body of Kelvani law as it stood in the year they carved it. 12 years of one man's work. He finished it, and he brought it up and he laid it in the pan and he stood there until the ordnance took him away. 6 paintings, a grain engine, the bones of an animal that the Calvani spent 2 centuries breeding into existence and then could not think what to do with, a rifle, a better rifle, a stack of sealed cases containing the complete recorded music of a coastal people who no longer exist, a locket, a prosthetic hand very finely made with the maker's name still legible on the wrist, somebody's tooth. And near the rim, where the newer things go, a child's ration book from the siege year with the coupons still in it, unspent. All of that, piled and crossed and settled and dusted over an age of it, the whole strained heaving evidence of a people saying, look, look what we are worth. And the beam hanging dead level over the top of it, saying nothing at all. You see why they never dared take a hammer to it. And you see, too, why nobody in the directorate has ever stood up in the chamber and said the words "it is broken." There is not a Calvani alive with a mouth that will shape it. They will say the silence. They will say the long level. They will say in the counting houses with a certain kind of look, the stone keeps its own hours, but not broken, never that. The humans say it. We have been on Island 60-odd years, brought in under labor contract to work the salvage that the Calvani do not care to work themselves, and we say it in the barracks all the time. It's a busted scale, Emric. Somebody welded the beam, that's all that is. And the Calvani hear us say it, and they do not answer because we are the ones who do the low work, and what the low work says does not have to be answered. That is what I want you to hold in your mind, not the stone, the arrangement, who did the low work and who did not, and how nobody thought about it at all. Vesa Marn weighed scrap. That was the whole of it. She had a covered stall at the head of number 4 pier, a beam scale on a stone plinth, a set of brass weights in a wooden case, a stool she never sat on, and a ledger. When a Calvani porter came off the salvage boats with a bundle on his back, he brought it to Vesa and she weighed it and she wrote the number, and the number was what he was paid, and the number was also what he was docked against if his bundle came in under the day's quota. That was the system. The directorate set the quota. Vesa's beam decided who met it. She was 53 the year this happened. She was not tall. She had a face like a fence post and hands that had been broken and reset more than once, and she wore her hair cut close because there is machinery on a salvage pier and hair is a thing that gets caught. If you passed her in the street you would not have looked twice, and I want that written plainly, because afterward there were a great many people who claimed they had always seen something in her, and they had not. There was nothing in her to see. There was only what she did, every day, for 30 years, in front of everybody, where nobody looked. I knew her because I kept her scale. Once a month I came down the pier with my roll of tools and I checked her knife edges and I trued her beam and I laid my certified weights on her pan, 1 gram, 10, 100, a kilo, 5, and watched the pointer and made my mark in the book. It is a job that takes 40 minutes if the scale is good. Vesa's scale was always good. She kept the pan wiped. She kept the bearing dry. She never once let a porter set a hand on the beam, not even to steady it, because a hand on a beam is a hand on a man's wages. That is how honest her scale was, and everybody knew it, and that is exactly what makes the other thing so strange. Because Vesa Marn stole from that scale every single day of her working life. Not the way you are thinking. She never took anything she gave. Here is how it went. A porter, I will call him Duvo because there was a Duvo, and because there were 40 others just like him, comes off the boat at the end of the shift. He is Calvani, which means he is a head taller than a man and thin as a rope, and he has been down in the flooded hold of a dead freighter since before dawn with a cutting torch, and he is carrying a bundle of stripped copper on his back. The quota is 30 kilos. He is old or he is sick. Or the hold was bad that day, and what he has on his back is 26. He puts it on the pan, and Vesa Marn, who has stood at that scale since she was 23, looks at the pointer, and she looks at Duvo, and then she reaches over to the case of brass weights, and she takes out 4 kilos of brass, and she puts them on the pan with his copper. And she writes 30. And in the margin of her ledger, in the narrow column where a clerk is supposed to note the weather or the state of the goods, she writes one word: carried. Then, at the end of the week, when the directorate's collector comes down the pier with his book, and the copper vessel has certified is 4 kilos lighter than the number she wrote, that shortfall is charged against the clerk. It comes out of her pay. It came out of her pay for 30 years. She did not hide it. That is the thing that nobody afterward could get through their heads. She did not falsify anything. The brass was right there in the pan in front of the porter, in front of God and the directorate and anybody standing on number 4 pier. Every kilo she carried was written in her ledger in her own square handwriting with the date beside it. Anyone could have opened that book any morning of any year and read the whole of it. The collector knew. The collector docked her and moved on. The directorate knew in the way that a large body knows a small thing, which is to say it appeared as a line in an account somewhere and nobody read the line. The porters knew, obviously. They did not talk about it. It is a hard thing to talk about, being carried. I asked her about it once. It was early and the fog was in off the water and I had her beam apart on the plinth and I said, without looking up, "You're 4,000 kilos down, Vesa. I did the arithmetic off your book. 4,000 and some." She said, "Sounds about right." I said, "That's a house. That's a house on the terraces is what that is." And Vesa Marn stood there with her arms folded and looked out at the fog, and said the only thing I ever heard her say about it in 30 years. She said, "The scale's honest. Somebody's got to carry the difference. Might as well be somebody who can." Then she asked me if I was going to be much longer, because the boats were coming in. The assay court opened once a year, on the first flat day after the rains, and the directorate laid an offering in the pan. You have to understand what that had become. Nobody expected anything anymore. It had been a religious act once, and then a political one, and by the time I came to Alan, it was mostly a very expensive municipal habit, like the way a family goes on setting a place at the table for someone who is not coming back. The directorate would spend a year arguing about what to lay in the pan. The ordinance would carry it up the hill in a slow procession with the bells going. Senu Rao, who was a say ordinant then and had been for 40 years, would say the words. Everyone would look at the beam. The beam would not move. Everyone would go down the hill and get drunk. That year the directorate had decided on the deep charter. I do not know the whole of what it was. Some of it was legal, and some of it was scientific, and most of it was above me. What I know is that it had taken 11 years and the work of 9,000 people, and that it was the founding instrument of the Watershare Treaty that had ended 400 years of killing between the coast and the hill provinces. They had it printed on sheets of a stable alloy and bound between 2 plates, and it weighed a little over 300 kilos, and it was, by any measure that a person could think of, the best thing the Kelvani had made in 6 centuries. People wept in the street when it went by. They carried it up the hill. And then at the top in front of the court, the procession stopped, and there was a long delay, and word came back down the line of what the trouble was. The pan was full. 1,100 years of tribute, and no one had cleaned it out, because no one had ever needed to, because things had always just been laid on top. But the deep charter was 300 kilos, and it was large, and it had to lie flat, and there was nowhere to lay it. There was a rusted crown and a keel boss and a jade cabinet and a grain engine and 6 paintings and a hand and a tooth, and there was no flat place anywhere in that pan the size of a door. So they needed the pan cleared, and they needed it cleared carefully and quickly by people who knew how to shift heavy, awkward things by hand without dropping them, and by people whose hands were allowed to touch what was in that pan, which this is the part that turns everything, and it turns on nothing, on a matter of ritual bookkeeping 400 years old, which no Kelvani hand was. The tribute in the pan belonged to the stone. A Kelvani who touched it was taking back what had been given. There was a word for that in their law, and the penalty attached to the word had not been repealed, only unused. But a human is not a party to that law. A human is contract labor. A human's hands are, for these purposes, not hands at all. They are tools, and the court had used human tools before to sweep the floor and clear the drains and grease the chains, and it had never signified anything. They sent down to the port for a salvage crew and a weigh-clerk. Salvage, because that was the work. Strip a fouled space, sort it, stage it, log it. And a weigh-clerk because every item that came out of that pan had to be weighed and recorded before it went into the archive, or the directorate would have a scandal on its hands within the week. That is why Vesa Marn walked up the hill to the assay court on the 9th morning after the rains. Not because anybody chose her. Because she had the best beam scale on number 4 pier and I had trued it 11 days before, and because the note that came down said, "Send your best clerk," and the pier master looked at his list and sent the one who never made an error. I went with her. I went because a portable beam scale is a fragile thing on a stone floor, and somebody had to shim the plinth. That is the entire reason I was there. 41 years of mending balances, and the one time it mattered I was there to shim a plinth. It was flat gray morning light, the way it always is after the rains, the sky the color of old zinc and the sun somewhere behind it making no shadows at all. There must have been 300 Kelvani up there. Ordnance in their pale robes along the eastern colonnade. Directorate officers on the platform. The deep charter on its bier, waiting. Senural at the rail with his hands folded. A very old man, taller than any of them and stooped like a hook, who had said the words at that rail every year since before I was born and had never once heard an answer. And out on that seamless floor, 6 human salvage hands, 1 human balance mender on his knees with a shim, and Vesa Marn. She set her scale up 11 strides from the pan. She squared it to the floor. She had me check it, and I checked it, and it was true. She opened her ledger and dated the page and ruled her columns and put her pen down and rolled her sleeves. Then she went and looked into the pan of the reckoning stone, the way she looked into any fouled load, with her chin down and her eyes moving and her mouth shut. It took 4 hours. The crown came out first because it was on top, and it came apart in her hands, and she stopped and gathered every flake of the rust into a cloth and weighed the cloth and wrote it down. Iron, corroded, 3.1 kilos including 0.4 kilos recovered scale. Then the tooth, which she weighed at 11 grams and put in a box. Then the paintings, one at a time, the crew lifting and Vesa calling the weights. Then the rifle and the better rifle. Then the locket which had a picture in it, which nobody looked at, because she closed it and weighed it closed. The jade cabinet took an hour and a half. It was the thing she was most afraid of, and she did not let the crew touch it. She got a plank and she and I slid it under, and we brought those 11 leaves out one by one, and the light came through them. And on the 7th leaf there was a hairline crack that had been there for 400 years, and Vesa noted it in the margin so that no one would say she made it. The keel boss they had to bring a chain hoist for. The grain engine came out in pieces. The bones went into 2 crates. The sealed music cases she stacked and weighed as one lot, 106 kilos, and she wrote the number of cases beside the weight. And at the very bottom of the pan, under everything, flattened, foxed, gone soft as cloth with age, the child's ration book from the siege year. She picked it up with 2 fingers. She stood there a moment with it. It weighed 9 grams. She wrote 9 grams and she wrote in the margin column in the same square hand. The same words she had been writing in that column for 30 years, because she did not know what else to put, and the column had to have something in it. Carried. Then she put the ration book in the last box, and the pan was empty. And here is where a Kelvani would have stopped, and where a directorate officer would have called it finished, and where the whole of history would have gone on exactly as it had gone on before. Because the pan was empty, and it was also filthy. 1100 years of rust bloom and jade dust and rotted cloth and pigeon lime and grit, and the black grease of the chain hoist we had just used. A 1/4 inch of it, thick in the seams, caked at the rim, and a bright new scar of hoist grease down one flank where the strop had dragged. Vesamarn stood there looking at it for maybe 4 seconds. And then she did the thing, and she did it without ceremony and without asking anybody, because in her whole life nobody had ever needed to tell her. She went to her kit, and she got out her rag and her stone soap. You do not weigh anything on a fouled pan. Not scrap, not copper, not a treaty. That is not a philosophy. It is the first thing you are taught on the first day, and it is why my trade exists. Grease on a pan is a lie, and grit in a seam is a lie, and a hair of rust on a knife edge is a lie, and the man who lets a lie sit on his scale is going to take it out of somebody's wages, and probably not his own. She climbed up onto the rim, and she knelt in that pan the way I had seen her kneel in her own for 30 years, and she washed it. She washed the floor of it in circles, working out from the middle. She got the grease with the stone soap, and she got the seams with the corner of the rag wrapped round her thumbnail. She wiped the rim. She ran the rag down each of the 4 chains as far as she could reach, and she stopped and squinted up at the beam, and she said to me, "Emric, that near chain's twisted." And I said this, out loud, in the assay court of Hesh Vara, in front of 300 Kelvani and the assay ordinate and the deep charter of the Watershare Treaty. And I said it in exactly the tone you would use on number 4 pier. Then untwist it. So she untwisted it. She put both hands on the link and she turned it a quarter, and it seated with a click I heard from where I knelt. And then Vesamarn straightened the 4 chains so they hung even, and gave the pan floor one last pass with the dry corner of the rag, and climbed down, and stepped back 3 paces, and stood with the rag in her hand, and looked at her work. That is all she did. She did not ask it anything. She did not touch the standard. She did not lay a thing in the pan, and she did not take a thing out of it that she had not been ordered to take out. She emptied it because they told her to, and then she cleaned it because she was Vesamarn and a pan was in front of her. For 1100 years, every hand that came to the reckoning stone came to put something in. Hers was the first that ever came to take something off. I did not see the beam move. I want to be truthful about that. I was watching her because she had the rag in her hand, and I was thinking that we were going to be short on time to get the plinth broken down before the bells. What I saw was the light change on the floor. The pan came up. It came up slow, the way a thing comes up that weighs 11 tons and has decided to. It came up out of the shadow it had stood in for an age, and the flat gray morning light went in under it, across a strip of pale stone floor that no living creature had ever seen, and the shadow slid away toward the columns like water off a table. The chains sang. That is the only word. 4 chains coming up under load and turning, and every link talking to the next one, and the sound went up the columns and came down again, and 300 Kelvani made no noise at all. And the beam of the reckoning stone tipped. Not level. That is what I need you to understand, because everybody who was not there says it balanced at last, and it did not. It did nothing of the kind. It tipped. The empty right-hand pan rose and rose until the chain stood taut and the beam stood at a slant a child could have measured with a stick, and the sealed left-hand pan, the standard, went down. Down and down until it touched the floor. The standard was heavier than nothing. Of course it was. It was heavier than an empire's crown and a warfleet's keel and 11 leaves of jade and the whole recorded music of a drowned people, because for 1100 years all of that together had never moved it one hair, and now with nothing at all against it, it went down like a stone into water and sat on the floor. It had never been level because the 2 sides were equal. It had been level because the beam had never been free. There had never been an honest reading taken on the reckoning stone in the entire history of Alan, because there had never been a moment when somebody had cleared the pan and cleaned it and trued the chains and stepped back and let the thing swing. Senu Rao came down off the rail. 40 years inordinate, and he came down the steps like a man going into cold water, and he stopped 10 paces from Vesamarn, and he did not look at her. He looked at the beam. Then he said quietly to nobody, "Put it back." They put it back. That is the part I think about most. That is the part I would take out of the record if I could, and I cannot because I stood there and let it happen. They brought up the crates. They opened them. 6 Kelvani officers directed and 6 human salvage hands lifted, and they put the crown back in the pan and the keel boss and the paintings and the rifle and the better rifle and the jade, leaf by leaf, and the bones and the tooth. And the beam did not move. They kept going. They put the grain engine in pieces. They put the music cases in, all of them, 106 kilos. A young officer went up and put his own sidearm in. Senu Rao took off his ordnance chain, which is a thing that has hanged men, and he laid it on top of the heap with his own hands. And the beam did not move, not one hair, not the width of a hair. The empty side stayed up. The standard stayed down on the floor. 12 tons of the finest work of a civilization sat in that pan, and the reckoning stone weighed the whole of it at exactly nothing, and went on leaning where it leaned. Senu Rao said, "Take it out again." They took it out again. It went faster the second time. And when the pan was empty and only the smears of their handling were on it, the beam still did not move because the beam had already moved. It was where it had gone. Nothing they had done had changed it by a hair in either direction. The beam was not weighing the pan. I watched an officer work it out. I watched it go through him. He was standing on the platform with a slate in his hand, and he lifted his eyes off the slate and looked along the line of the beam, down the slant of it, the way you sight along a rifle. The high end, where it was pointing. It was pointing off the end of its own arm, past the rim, out across the floor, at a 53-year-old human weigh-clerk, standing 11 strides away with a dirty rag in her hand. He said something in Kelvani. I did not understand the word. I have asked since, and I have been given 4 different translations, and none of them are any good. The nearest is plumb, as in, the line a weight makes when you hang it. Then he pointed at Vesa with the slate, and he said in trade speech, so that everyone would understand, "Move her." They moved her. They marched her 12 paces to the left. The beam did not follow. Somebody let out a breath. Then Senu Rao said, "No, move everyone." And they cleared that floor. 300 people. Ordnance, officers, salvage hands, myself, all of us herded back between the columns, until the only living thing on the great seamless stone floor of the assay court was Vesa Marn, standing where they had put her, holding her rag with the empty pan hanging over her head. The beam turned. Slow, grinding. A sound out of the sealed fulcrum housing like a mountain clearing its throat, the first sound that housing had made in 1100 years. The whole beam swung on its post, 12 strides of gray-green stone, until the high end of it came around and stopped, pointing down the slant, straight and level and unmistakable, at the woman on the floor. They tried her ledger next. It was Senu Rao's idea, and it was, I think, the last idea of a mind that had spent 40 years being told nothing. He sent an archivist to Vesa's plinth for the day book she had ruled that morning, and then, when that told them nothing, he sent a rider down the hill to number 4 pier for the rest. 30 years of them. 31 ledgers in a hand cart, brown, swollen with damp, the corners eaten. They brought them up the hill, and they stacked them on the platform, and the archivist opened the oldest one at the first page and read it out. Date, porter's mark, goods, weight, and the margin column where the clerk notes the weather or the state of the goods. Carried. He turned the page, carried. He turned it again, twice on that page. He went forward a year and a decade, and the word was there, and there, and there, in a square, honest hand that had never once been altered or erased, because Vesa Marn had never in her life falsified a number and had never once thought that what she was doing needed hiding. The archivist stopped reading somewhere in the 19th ledger. He put it down, and he stood there with his hand flat on the cover. I heard a Kelvani officer ask him what the word meant. And the archivist, a young man I remember with ink on his fingers, said, It means she paid it. Then he said, it means she paid it 4,000 and some times. And a porter's voice from back in the crowd, one of the ones they had brought up for the lifting, said in trade speech, not loudly, the way you say something you have been carrying a long time. She never told us, we had to work it out. I do not know when the Kelvani understood it. I understood it standing between two columns with my shim still in my hand, and I understood it in my trade, because it is a thing my trade knows and philosophy does not. A standard is not a champion. When I certify Vessa's scale, I do not put the best weight I own in the pan. I do not put the heaviest. I put the true one. There is a mass in a vault somewhere, a lump of dull metal that nobody would look at twice, and it is not precious and it is not beautiful and it did not win any wars, and every honest scale in the settled worlds is honest because, at the end of a long chain of comparisons, it comes back to that lump. It is not better than the things it weighs. It is not stronger. It is simply the thing that does not change, that does not add anything of its own to the pan, that will lie against nobody. That is a measure. The Ishan built a balance the size of a temple, and they sealed the standard in a shell of stone, and they left it on a hill above a harbor, and they went away into whatever dark they went into. And every people that came after looked at that empty pan and understood the invitation exactly backwards. Show us your worth. So they piled it up. Crowns and keels and law and music and the tooth of somebody's saint. Look, look what we are. Weigh us. And the stone never answered, because you cannot weigh a thing against a thing that is being weighed. Because the beam was not free. Because for 1100 years the pan was never once empty, and no one, not one dynasty, not one occupation, not one starving man in the siege year, had ever come up that hill to take something off. The standard on the left was not a treasure. I know what was in it now. Everybody does. It was opened afterward, and there is nothing in it, and there never was. It is a sealed shell full of nothing at all, and it weighs what nothing weighs, and it went to the floor because it was leaning against a life. The reckoning stone was never looking for the greatest thing a people had made. It was looking for the thing they measured by. The one who took weight off. The one who did it in the open and wrote it in the margin and paid and did not speak of it and could not have told you why, and would have gone on doing it if the stone had stayed asleep another 1100 years, which it would have, because there had never been anybody, on any world it had ever waited on, who thought that the cleaning of the pan was part of the work. Humanity thought so. That is the whole of it. That is the entire inheritance, and it is not a weapon, and it is not a bloodline, and there is no glory anywhere in it. We keep ledgers. Every species keeps ledgers. And then, when the number is short and the man is old and the hold was bad that day, some of us put 4 kilos of our own brass in the pan and write 30 and eat the difference for 30 years. Nobody gave Vesamarn anything that day. The stone did not hand her a crown or an army or a name out of a prophecy. It looked at what she had already been doing since she was 23 in front of everybody, where nobody looked, and it did the only thing a scale can do. It leaned toward her, and it said what she weighed. It spoke at the 8th hour, when the light was going flat and yellow over the western columns. The voice did not come from the beam or the pans or the sealed housing. It came up out of the floor, out of that one seamless sheet of pale stone, so that every person standing on it felt it in the bones of their feet before they heard it in the air. It was not loud. It was under the register where loud lives. It was 4 words, in trade speech, the flattened dockyard cant that Kelvani porters and human clerks used to talk about copper. And I have thought about that for 11 years, and I have never gotten to the bottom of it. The reckoning stone said, "You are the measure." That was all. It never spoke again. Vesamarn stood there with the rag in her hand and the beam pointing at her, and 300 people on their knees behind her. And she did not weep, and she did not raise her arms, and she did not say anything back to it. What she did was look up at the pan, and then along the beam, and then at the chains, checking them, the near one she had untwisted and the 3 others, seeing that they hung even. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded at me when the certification was done and the book was signed. Then she turned around and she looked for me in the crowd, and when she found me she said, across that whole floor, in a completely ordinary voice, "Emric, the plinth will lose the light." They offered her everything. I was there for most of it, and it went on for 2 years. The directorate offered her a seat in the chamber, and then, when she declined, a seat with no duties, and then a stipend, and then a house on the terraces. The house, the actual house, the one I had told her about at 4,000 kilos, and I do not think they ever knew that, and I never told them. The ordinance offered her the rail. There was a faction that wanted her declared the living standard, and there was a faction that wanted her studied, and there was a faction, small but loud and rich, that wanted the stone dismantled on the grounds that a scale which can be satisfied by contract labor is not a scale but an insult. A survey company came back with better bore heads. Senu Rao met them at the head of the road and stood there until they turned around, which is the only thing that old man ever did that I truly admired. Vesa took none of it. She went back to number 4 pier, and she opened her stall on the second morning after, and she weighed scrap. She let them keep the ledgers because they asked, and because she said the directorate had paid for the paper. They are in a case in the court now, all 31, open at different pages, and Kelvani come up the hill and stand and read a margin column in a language most of them cannot read, and go down again quiet. She let them film her once, and she was very bad at it. What she would not do ever in 11 years was let anybody call her by the word. The Kelvani made a word for it, a good one, a heavy one out of the old high tongue, and the first time an ordinant used it to her face on the pier, Vesa Marn put down her pen and said, "I'm the clerk," and picked her pen back up. The ordinant came back the next week and tried again and got the same 4 words. He came, I am told, 11 times. On the 12th he brought a bundle of copper off the boats and put it on her pan and stood there while she weighed it. And she weighed it, and it was under. And she took 4 kilos of brass out of the case and set them beside his copper and wrote 30, and wrote carried in the margin, and handed him his chit. He never used the word again. He is the assay ordinant now. Things changed on Alan, in the way things change, which is slowly and not where you were looking. They stopped weighing their dead. That was an old Kelvani custom, an assay of a life at the burial, a reckoning of what the person had put into the world against what they had taken, and it went out within a decade and nobody voted on it. It simply stopped, the way a thing stops when everybody has quietly understood that they have been doing the arithmetic in the wrong direction for 4,000 years. The directorate opened the labor contracts, not out of goodness, out of arithmetic. It is difficult to keep a class of people whose hands are not hands when the reckoning stone has leaned toward one of them in front of 300 witnesses and used the dockyard cant to do it. And every year, on the first flat day after the rains, they bring something up the hill and lay it in the pan of the reckoning stone, and the beam does not move. It has never moved again. It stands exactly where it stood at the 8th hour of that gray morning, tipped, the standard down on the floor, the empty pan up in the light, the high end of that great gray-green arm pointing off across the seamless stone at a place on the floor where nobody stands anymore. They keep the pan clean now. That is the offering. That is the whole of the ceremony as it exists today. A human and a Kelvani go up together with a rag and stone soap, and they wash it out and true the chains and step back, and everyone looks at the beam that will not move, and then they all go down the hill. Vesa Marn died 4 years ago in the winter of nothing in particular at 70. She was at the stall the week before. Her scale is in the case now with the ledgers, and I trued it myself for the last time before they took it, out of my own pocket on my own day, because a scale that goes into a museum out of true is a lie that will sit there for 1,000 years. I have mended balances for 41 years, and I have certified perhaps 9,000 of them, and I know what a true scale sounds like when it settles. The only true one I ever saw in my life had a sealed shell full of nothing on the one side, And on the other side, it had a woman with a rag in her hand who had spent 30 years quietly taking the weight off other people. And it never came level, and it never will. I do not think it was ever supposed to.